Are necromorphs with ray tracing more impressive than this? Let's find out. We live in an era of remakes, remasters, spiritual successors and long-dead game revivals. Bad news for new and fresh IPs, but really good news for some old and crustier games. Until recently, I think it was generally accepted that Resident Evil 2 Remake is the best remake, that it is the correct way to honor older games. But that might have changed as newly released Dead Space Remake, as some have claimed, is the new golden standard. So, naturally, I wanted to compare these two games to see which one of these is the true king of remasters. Now, obviously, it's a very subjective thing, but I will lay out my reasoning and my considerations, and even if you don't agree with me, maybe you will still find something you agree with. If not, write down in the comments why I suck. Before we get into the remakes themselves, we must take a closer look at the history of these two game series. Curiously, both of them intertwine multiple times in our story. Original Resident Evil 2 is the oldest of these two games, and I think many modern gamers would find it hard to play original Resident Evil 2 today. It was released for Sony PlayStation in 1998. It's the second game in Resident Evil series that through its 27 years will spawn 10 mainline series games and in total around 30 games. If you count pachinko machines, and Japan will not forgive you if you do not, then even more. Resident Evil 2 was made by around 50 people and was led by producers Shinji Mikami, who later will create Evil Within, the love letter to Resident Evil 4, and director Hideki Kamiya, who will later work on Devil May Cry and will create Platinum Games, best known for Ultra Sultry Witch, Bayonetta. Resident Evil 1 Biohazard, as it was called in Japan, was received very well. It got high praises, and looking back at it now, we can almost see how it influenced horror survival genre. And by the way, the remaster of this game is great also, but that's not the story today. So the sequel of Resident Evil needed to be good, it needed to be awesome. Stories say that the first version of the sequel, now called Resident Evil 1.5, was not very good, and Shinji scrapped it. You see, they wanted it to be more cinematic, more bombastic, more frightening, just bigger and better. Mikami has said that the first version was too dull and not exciting enough. After all, Capcom said they had to sell 2 million copies, and so the game was returned to the drawing board and it was remade, and it turned out great. It received high praises and convinced Capcom to work on next games in the series. Capcom and reviewers were especially happy with the zapping system, by which each of the two player characters, Leon and Claire, are confronted with different puzzles and storylines in their respective scenarios. After finishing the A scenario with one protagonist, a B scenario is unlocked, and you can see different story events from other characters' perspective. The player may start the A scenario with either of the two protagonists, resulting in a total of 4 different scenarios. And you can even choose to not pick up certain items in scenario A to leave them for the next playthrough. The gameplay, as you can see, was mostly the same tank controls with painted, mostly static backgrounds as in the first game, but the weird camera angles working together with great sound made for a really good game. But let's fast forward 21 years. It's 2019, Capcom and Resident Evil are riding another high after the release of fantastic Resident Evil 7, a game that, as did Resident Evil 4 many years ago, made a huge change to the series and brought swarms of new fans to the Biohazard fandom. Well, to be fair, the work on Resident Evil 2 Remake started already in 2015, so even 2 years before Resident Evil 7 was released. It has been said that various people in Capcom have been talking about remaking Resident Evil 2 since they remade the original game for GameCube in 2002, but I guess they never found the right time or the right way to do it. And I think I'm glad they waited. So they decided to remake this game quite drastically. Static camera angles gone, tank controls gone. It's now a third-person action game, closer to Resident Evil 4 than the original game. The game strives for more horror when compared to the Resident Evil 2, but there are still enough action set pieces for it to not feel boring. It sold good. People loved it, and most notably everyone was impressed by how this remake captures and is very faithful to the original game, while at the same time offering a completely different and modern experience. It was hailed as the golden standard of remakes. Later, when PS5 released and Demon's Souls, the forefather of Dark Souls series, was remade, the largest criticism levied against it that it was too perfect of a remake. That is to say, while they had to rebuild the game from the ground up, they still chose to keep some of the frustrating and poorly aged mechanics and systems that made the gameplay very clunky. While Resident Evil 2 was way smarter about it. They knew what to keep and what to let go. Now let's jump from Japan and Capcom to USA. In 2006, one of the EA, yes, that EA, the evil one, studios, EA Redwood Shores, pitched a horror game for Xbox, while studio lead Glenn Schofield, who will later move on to make this sort of disappointing Callisto Protocol, initially wanted to make a System Shock game. The release of Resident Evil 4 in 2005 changed that. Inspired by Capcom's massive success and movies like Event Horizon, Redwood, later known as Visceral Games, envisioned a space horror game. Schofield has said that he wanted to make the scariest game he could. Did he succeed? I think so, yes.
This is Benson. Everybody listen up. They're using the vents. That's how they're getting around the ship. Stay away from now. Get back! Get back!
So they made it in 2 years, and while the reception as horror games in general are a niche product at first was lukewarm, the good reviews and word of mouth got around and people found that it is a really great game. It combined the third-person close-to-the-shoulder camera gameplay of Resident Evil 4 with faster gameplay and some smart design choices that made this, in my opinion, one of the best games ever made. Not just horror. All games. Dead Space is one of the best games ever made. It's a very dense game, both in the sense of gameplay and design. From the story perspective, it does not feel dragged out, and from the visual and the level design, everything feels very physical. Boxes and cables all over the place. It feels like a ship, a planet breaker that people would actually use for mining. It feels alive, just like in the movie Alien. You can feel the ship, you can sense how people could live on it, how they could exist, because it is built very physically, it is built with much thought about the realities of the ship, and that was really great about Dead Space. The second game was even better, it improved upon everything, but it was not meant to be. As everything EA touches, Dead Space 3 came out and it leaned away from horror, more in favor of action. There was a shoehorned co-op mode in the game, and that spelled the end for the series, because EA will never admit that they did something wrong. No, of course not. It's the gamers. They don't want a single player game, they don't like horror, or some other reason, whatever execs in their board meetings tell each other. So Dead Space was left alone for quite some time, until Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 2 Remake came along and reignited horror genre and showed EA that big piles of cash can be gained from it. So in 2020-21 they decided to do a remake. They started working on it. And now, in 2023, just a month after Dead Space spiritual successor Callisto Protocol came out, and a month before Resident Evil 4 Remake comes out, Dead Space Remake is out. And while I'm skeptical about everything EA does, well damn, it turned out good, and the internet seems to agree. Staying true or reinventing? So let's talk about remakes. What paths did they choose? So, Dead Space. It's a very faithful remake. Some might even question why did they even need to do that, as the original one with some visual mods and mouse control fixes is still very playable and very enjoyable game. Here is the comparison. Note, the original game here is slightly modded, so it doesn't look exactly like it did in 2008. But whatever were the EA reasons, money, money. This time it does not detract from the quality of the remake. It's great. It's one of those remakes that makes the game feel as good as it appears in your memory. The same, by the way, was done by Toys for Bob when remaking Spyro. Also one of my favorite remakes that I love to play. Our brain, for some reason, makes everything 4K in our memory. If we liked that game, if we liked that movie, especially if we played it a long time ago, especially at the time when we were young, in our memories it looks really, really great. It plays really, really great, and we have all these fond memories. So that's what they did. They remade the Dead Space so it feels and looks and plays the way it is in our memories. The remake faithfully and quietly fixes and improves things, and leaves some things untouched, like for example the great approach to no HUD. Remake team of course added some things like backtracking and some expanded areas, not just in the amount of area but also in the density of environment. Everything now feels even more real, but the person who played the original, let's say 10 years ago, might not even remember what was there and what was not. They would just have around the same feelings they had when they played the original game. So we can call this a stealth remake. So what about Resident Evil 2? As we already touched upon it, it's quite the upgrade. The game of course needed that. Well, maybe not needed, because there is nothing wrong with some games or movies by that matter staying the way they were, but if the remake does not destroy the original, then it's fine. We have two good versions of the game to play. If not for the story and characters, this could easily be sold as a new mainline entry game from Resident Evil series, or just completely different zombie game. At least that's how it could feel for the gamers who were not around in 1998 to play the original. If you have played the original, you will notice things from story to various other elements that recall the original. Even though it's hard to compare the original police station to this one, there is something very familiar. Same goes for the other locations, enemies and weapons. Everything has this sense of familiarity. Capcom, as one of the project leads said in an interview, tried to capture the spirit of the original game. And they sure did it. We can call this an overt remaster. So yeah, we already know that these two remakes are great. Chef's kiss, but what are the specific highlights? What did they do so good that these two games probably will be mentioned over and over and over again for at least couple of years? Well, Resident Evil 2, we'll see what happens with Resident Evil 4 remake, but Dead Space Remake is going to be mentioned over and over and over again for at least couple of years, definitely. RE2's highlight definitely is Mr. X. There is no contest that this blue man, either in speedos or dressed more suited for the job, is scary as hell. This is probably the best deviation they did, because while in the original game Tyrant Enemy appeared, it was only in B scenario, basically New Game Plus, and he was scripted to appear in certain rooms, and of course he could not leave those rooms, so it was way less scary. In the remake, he can chase you around throughout the police station, and what's even more interesting, as some YouTube videos point out, Capcom programmed him so he will always roam the halls. That is, even though probably easier it would be to make him to teleport around, he does not do that. While you are in the police station, he is always walking around looking for you, attracted by your gunfire. That is really amazing. Mr. X is menacing, he is unstoppable, he can't be killed, just stunned, but most of the time, since it's a survival horror game, it's waste of ammo, so you must run. The legend is that tyrant enemies were inspired by the Terminator movies, an unstoppable force chasing fragile humans, and I can believe that, it feels like that. So this is definitely the best thing they did. The other one probably is the transition to a camera player controls. While there is room for retro fixed camera games, I think Capcom made the right choice, as that frees them to make enemies more aggressive, and they have to find more creative solutions to hide the enemies in the environment, as in the old version it was enough to keep the zombie out of the camera frame for some cheap jump scares. And of course the general atmosphere and the ambience of the game, it is way improved when compared to the original games thanks to the technical advancements. It makes for a really scary game. And yeah, that's in a big part is thanks to the Mr. X, but there are definitely other things also. It is a really smartly planned out and well made game. And for a horror game, that is really great. So what did Dead Space do better? This one is harder because, as we discussed, this is a stealth remake. But one of the things is the visual design. The game looks fantastic. I would say the game looks next gen. Necromorphs are a freaky concept in general, and this game holds true to the idea, making it a truly horrific experience thanks to the graphical and other advancements made in video games since 2008. And in general, they keep on with the spirit of the game, trying to make the scariest game possible with a system called Intensity Director. Its main goal is to raise the fear factor with a sudden enemy spawn or changing the atmosphere, such as the dimming of the lights, adding fogs, or creating safe spots for the players to rest from the enemies and horror situations. And man, I must say, this game got me. While I have played Dead Space and replayed the first few hours quite a lot of times, I still got spooked by the new version. Even though many things are the same, the improved sound, lighting, atmosphere does a lot to make me nervous. Other major improvement is that the game sneakily became more open. It's one of those things a person who played it a while ago might not even recognize and just assume that Dead Space in 2008 already was this open, but no. New design with removed loading and divided areas allows for a smooth backtracking, and that is very smartly tied with semi-secret rooms and even secret ending in the new game plus. Oh, and in this version Isaac talks. Again, many might not remember, but he was one of the silent protagonists. A rarity in 2008, by the way.
Reading the door malfunction between you and the maintenance bay. Can you fix it?
No, but I found a stasis module. If I'm faster than...
But these games are not perfect. No game is. Here are the couple of things that I think they could have done a little bit better. Well, for Dead Space, it's probably that some of the death scenes, for example, in the final boss fight one, feels more tame. They feel, for some reason, even though they are more graphically advanced, they have better sound design, they feel more tame. They do not feel as gory and visceral as they could be. And that is very strange, because all other aspects of this game are turned up to 10. Everything feels more physical, everything feels more lived in, everything feels more visceral. From Isaac's stomp to how the weapons work and look and how they shoot. But for some reason, death scenes seem to be tamed down. Other thing that I'm not super fan of, the game is much darker, and I get that. Dark is scary, it's a primal fear, it is ingrained in our DNA, and it is much scarier when there are monsters in the dark. But I prefer the original balance of light and dark. A larger complaint is the last boss. As with the death scene, the last boss in general is not super fun. It was not super fun in the original, and it is not super fun here also. On one hand, I understand that horror games possibly don't even need bosses, as bosses are a very video gamey concept, and horror games win when people forget that they are playing a video game. And our other contender, well, in general, Resident Evil series is famous for having quite lame bosses. At least personally, I dislike most of Resident Evil bosses. So I understand, horror games and bosses do not mesh well. And that's why I have the question, why did Remake kept the final fight in the original form as it was in the classic 2008 game? Why didn't they try to do something more with it, something more inventive, maybe also something more horrific? Because now final boss is a very straightforward fight. Shoot the glowy bits and win. I would say the final boss is the biggest letdown of the whole game because everything else is so perfect, but the final boss is just a big giant tentacle thingy with glowy bits. What could have Resident Evil 2 done better? It feels like most Resident Evil games suffer from one thing: limp third act. They start out strong, like Resident Evil 2 Police Station, or Resident Evil 4 with Village and the Castle, and Resident Evil 7 with the main house and Jack stalking you. They are wonderful, they are chef's kiss. Middle part of these games usually is okay. You are in the groove, you know how the game works, you understand the mechanics, you start to be afraid a little bit less, but usually these games offer some different mechanics or some new challenge or something like that, so it's great. But then comes the third part, and the games either feel too long, like original Resident Evil 4, or Resident Evil 7, who became a first-person shooter. In Resident Evil 2 case, it's just not that fun and exciting. The laboratory feels quite linear and boring. While Mr. X makes a comeback and there are new enemies there, it doesn't feel that interesting. When compared to the police station, the laboratory area just pales. It's not that fun, it's not that interesting. I think they could have expanded a bit more on the final act of the game. One thing I really do not enjoy in Resident Evil 2 is the knife durability. I really don't know why knife had to be an expendable resource. I really like Resident Evil 4 and other games' approaches that knife is just a weapon you use when you are down on the ammo, because it's a survival horror game and it is a real option that you at some point in the game will be down on the ammo. Plus, if you have a knife, you can enable fun challenge runs like knife only and something like that. Durability puts stop to it. And call me woke, but one other thing that Remake might have done better would be not to use the classical pairing of man, Leon, gets to hang out with sexy spy, Ada, while the girl, Claire, has to save little girl, Sherry. I don't think it's an overt sexism, but there's something to it, and they might have mixed it up, at least in B scenarios, or done something slightly a bit different. But that's a minor gripe. One important thing is the gameplay, how these games play. Are they actually fun? Because most of the time when we turn on a video game, we actually want to play it. We want to participate in the story. We do not want to watch just a movie. Like with any other point here, Dead Space plays like it should. It plays the way I remember, which of course are fake memories, as the original was quite clunky. This is way smoother. It's the best way a modern action third-person horror game with a camera close to the back can play and move. It's good. They improved the handling and definitely the mouse and keyboard controls. RE2, like discussed, feels modern, but at the same time there is enough Resident Evil gameplay in it that it feels familiar. Everyone who has previously played any of Resident Evil games, even the new Resident Evil 7 and 8, will feel certain familiarity. I think it mixes the clunkiness survival horror game needs, because mobile characters remove some of the fright with enough mobility to not feel like a PlayStation 1 game, and that is done really well. Overall, game feels really good to play. The little things. Modern games can do a lot of things. Sometimes they can do grand things, but sometimes it's the little things that stay with us in the memory. In Resident Evil 2 Remake, you can shoot off the hat of Mr. X. It's a small thing, but a nice detail. Throughout the police station you can see liquor claw marks. Nothing major also, but nice little environmental storytelling. While I said that I don't like knife durability, one thing I do like, and it's not a huge thing, but I like that you can use a knife to stab a zombie that has grabbed you, and the knife will stay in his flesh and you will have to take out it after you kill the unlucky zombo. In Dead Space, weapons have cool animation. Just look at this, it's amazing, it feels so dimensional, it feels like you could actually build it. And of course, the game is famous for its sound design. And in the remake there are enough those ambient sounds from all over the place to make you feel unease and dread. Plus the peeling system where you can shoot and burn off the skin of enemies. It's gruesome, but wonderful. These little things are the ones that stick with you even years after you have finished the game. So, who won? While some say that Dead Space is the new gold standard, I think that Resident Evil 2 Remake is still a bit better. Why? Well, it benefits from its source material being older, made when games were way more limited. In 2008 we were already at what I would say is modern gaming. Crysis was out, man. Remember when no one could run Crysis? Yeah, so modern gaming. 3D was basically fully embraced, graphics were already pretty good, computers had enough power and memory to store and work with large files, internet was there to offer patches, mods, and of course, Horse Armor DLC.
All of this just works. It's not, I'm not kidding.
Thank you, Todd. And basically that means that from 2008 to now, nothing in the game designs have changed that much. Therefore, a faithful remake, while amazing, just does not pack the same wow effect as remaking an older game. Plus, I would say that Resident Evil 2 Remake did a bit more with the game. They expanded a bit more on the gameplay side, they added more. Sure, they took some things away like enemy spiders, but overall, that game feels like a net plus, while Dead Space is a net zero. Yes, it looks gorgeous, it plays awesome, but there are mods and active mod scene that can easily polish a 2008 game so it would not look even that bad today. Both of these are great games and their remaster ensures that other generations of gamers can find them more pleasant and easily accessible. Plus, they do not erase the old version of the game, at least for now. So, in the end we now have 2 Dead Spaces 1 and 2 Resident Evil 2s. So, that's a net plus. Well, here we are guys, thank you for watching and write down in the comments which remakes or remasters are your favorite. Maybe write down a game you are looking forward to be remastered or remade in some way. Or maybe if you just disagree with everything I said in this video, write that down as well. So, thank you and I will see you guys later, yeah? Bye.